Indian Airlines Flight 65 was coming from Bombay to Bangalore. The weather was clear, everything seemed normal. But as the plane approached Bangalore airport, things suddenly changed. The plane was flying really close to the ground. The speed was too high and the runway was way too close. No alarms, no warnings. Still, something wasn't right. Did the pilot know what he was doing, or was everything happening so fast that he didn't even get a chance to realize? So, what happened that day? How did a routine landing cost so many lives? Here's the heart-stopping story of Indian Airlines Flight 605. This is a true story. It happened on February 14, 1990, while people around the world were celebrating Valentine's Day. That day, an Airbus A320 was being prepared for a flight in India. The plane was set to fly from Mumbai to Bangalore. It was just a regular domestic flight, meant to take passengers from one city to another. As passengers were boarding, two experienced pilots were in the cockpit doing the necessary pre-flight checks. Sitting in the co-pilot's seat was Captain Cyril Fernandez, 46 years old, with over 9,000 hours of flying experience. The flight was quite an experience. But on this flight, he wasn't just flying the plane, he was also being tested. To become the captain of the Airbus A320, he had to complete a total of 10 flights on different routes, and this was the very first flight in that process. Until now, he had only logged 68 hours on the A320, and even then, only as a co-pilot. Sitting beside him in the right seat was Captain Gopujka, a 44-year-old Czech pilot. Basically, Gopujka was there to evaluate Fernandez's performance during the flight. He was an experienced instructor with over 10,000 hours of total flight time. He had flown 255 hours on the A320, out of which he was the pilot in command for 212 hours, so both pilots were overall very experienced. But their experience on the Airbus A320, a new and technically advanced aircraft, was still limited. And that wasn't unusual because the A320 was a new plane at the time, and many pilots were still learning to fly it. Usually, it takes a pilot 15 to 20 years to build up 10,000 hours of flying experience. There were 146 people on board, 139 passengers, 5 cabin crew, and 2 pilots. It was 11:58 in the morning. Flight 605 took off from Mumbai about an hour late. The flight started smoothly, and the plane climbed comfortably to 33,000 feet. As the flight headed towards Bangalore, all the passengers were settled in their seats, relaxed. It was a short domestic flight, so most people were completely at ease. Everything seemed normal. But no one had any idea that what was about to happen would become one of the most shocking events in India's aviation history. Let's now find out more about that plane. Everyone on board was traveling in an Airbus A320. It was the newest and most advanced plane of its time. Back in 1990, this aircraft was super new. It had a special system called fly-by-wire. This tech replaced the old, heavy mechanical controls. Before, pilots could feel how the plane was reacting through the controls when they pulled or turned them, but now, everything was electronic. When pilots pressed a button or made a move, it went straight to the computer, and the computer decided what to do. What would the plane do? It meant that the pilot no longer felt how the plane was flying. Now they had to rely solely on the screens and instruments. Even though this technology was very advanced, it had lessened that direct connection between the pilot and the aircraft. The 2 pilots of Flight 605 were still trying to fully understand and get used to this new technology. It was a new experience for them, and this was the question on their minds. Would this new tech save them from trouble or quietly lead them into danger? It was going to take them on the way. This plane had another important safety system called the Alpha Floor Protection System. Its job was to automatically boost engine power if the plane was flying too slowly and at risk of stalling, helping it climb back up. But the thing to note is that if the engine had completely slowed down, it took a full 8 seconds to regain power, and those 8 seconds would later prove to be crucial. Until then, everything seemed normal. The pilots were handling the flight calmly. But there was one thing that made this flight a little different. The thing was, this was a check flight. It wasn't just any regular flight, but more like a test. Captain Fernandez had to complete this flight properly to become a full captain on the A320. Meanwhile, Captain Gopujka was watching him closely, evaluating everything. Because of this, both pilots were under a lot of mental pressure. One had to prove himself, and the other had to keep an eye on every little detail. Even if everything seemed fine from the outside, that kind of pressure could really get to you inside, affecting their decisions, their communication, and more. Also about how they were flying. At 12:44 p.m., Control Tower sent a message that the flight could now descend to 11,000 feet. The weather was perfectly clear. There was a light breeze and the temperature was around 27 degrees Celsius. Everything was set for a perfect landing. But who knew that despite everything looking fine, something was about to happen that would slowly lead to a major accident, and no one had any clue. As Flight 605 was approaching Bangalore Airport, a slight tension started building up in the cockpit. Now the pilots. They were getting ready to land. the two pilots were having an important conversation, what in aviation is called an approach briefing. It basically means that before landing, both pilots get together to decide the next steps, like from what altitude and in which direction the plane should descend. The initial plan was clear. They were going to land on runway 09 using the DME approach. The DME approach is a method where the plane gradually comes down using radio signals from the ground. This was a familiar procedure for both pilots, and the crew was completely calm. But then something changed. A new message came from the control tower. Now, instead of relying on instruments, they had to land by visually spotting the runway. This is called a visual approach. In other words, the pilots had to land the plane by looking at the runway with their own eyes, not just their instruments. Sometimes this kind of change happens in the last moments of a flight, and it can even make landing easier. After that, the air traffic controller started giving directions to the pilots using radar, like turn left now or adjust to this angle, so that the plane was guided onto a path where the runway would come clearly into view. But there was a problem. The plan had suddenly changed. The pilots were mentally prepared to land by relying on their instruments. Now they had to make decisions by looking at the runway themselves. And the biggest thing was, this wasn't just a regular flight. It was a check flight, meaning one pilot was being tested while the other was closely watching every move. This sudden change only made the stress worse. After that, the pilots quickly came up with a new plan for the altitude and distance needed to land. They decided that when the plane is 11 miles or 17 kilometers away from the runway, it should be at an altitude of 6,000 feet, and when it's 7 miles out, the altitude should be 4,500 feet. Now, think about it. The pilots had planned their landing. But was that plan enough? Bengaluru Airport is built at about 3,000 feet above sea level. So, the ground elevation here is quite high compared to usual. Because of this, the pilot set a specific altitude of 3,280 feet. In aviation terms, this is called the minimum descent altitude. This means that if the plane reaches this altitude and still can't see the runway, they'll have to give up on landing and fly back up. Going down any further isn't considered safe. Around 12:53 p.m., Bangalore radar tracked the flight 42 nautical miles away from the runway and started guiding it for a visual approach. Everything seemed fine until now, but the real trouble was slowly closing in. When the pilots quickly checked their altitude, they realized they were at 8,500 feet. Air traffic control had cleared them to descend to 4,600 feet. The new altitude was immediately set on the panel that controls the plane. From this same panel, the pilot tells the autopilot important things like direction, speed, and altitude so the plane can fly the planned route on its own. At exactly 1 p.m., when the plane was about 7 miles from the airport, the pilots kept the autopilot on and activated a mode called the approach mode. This is a routine procedure. But right here, something started that would later turn out to be very important. When the approach mode is activated and speed control is in managed mode, then the plane slowly started to reduce its speed on its own. In planes like the Airbus, managed speed means the computer decides how fast the plane should go during different parts of the flight. On the other hand, when pilots control the speed themselves, it's called selected speed. In this flight, the pilots kept the speed at 132 knots, which is about 244 km/h in managed mode. As they were descending, the pilots were gradually getting ready to land, like lowering the flaps and putting the landing gear down. From the outside, everything seemed fine. But deep down, a danger was quietly growing. At that time, the flight director was active on the cockpit screen. It works just like a GPS. The screen shows which direction the plane should go. Pilots keep the plane steady by following these markers. But the problem was, the pilots were doing a visual approach, meaning they had to land by looking at the runway with their own eyes. If they focused too much on the markers on the screen, they might drift a bit from the actual runway position. It's just like when you're driving a car and try to watch both the GPS and the road signs at the same time. At 1:42 p.m., when the plane was about 7 miles from the runway, Captain Fernandez loudly says, "Runway in sight." This was a crucial moment because right after that, the autopilot was turned off. Now the pilots had full control. In other words, the computer was no longer flying the plane, the pilots were. But was having control solely in the pilot's hands enough? Or was the plane still slowly heading toward a danger that no one had noticed? As the plane starts descending from 5,000 feet, the automatic system itself, getting ready to stop at 4,600 feet. But at the same time, some other systems are also active, like the guide that shows direction on the screen and the speed control system. Just 2 seconds later, Captain Fernandez says, "All right, let's descend at 700 feet per minute," meaning he wanted the plane to come down a bit faster. Right then, the training captain, Captain Gopuj, was about to say something. But the air traffic control message comes in and cuts him off, leaving things unfinished. This is where the trouble starts. Actually, the co-pilot. Earlier, it was said that if the landing had to be cancelled, set the altitude to 6,000 feet to climb back up. This acts as a safety backup. But the training captain neither repeated this nor set the altitude. Instead, he told to use another method to bring the plane down, which the co-pilot agreed to. At that time, there were many things happening at once in the cockpit, and in that rush, a big mistake happened. That mistake put the plane in a dangerous situation called the idle open descent mode. This is the condition when the power drops a lot. In other words, the plane no longer relies on the engine but just on its speed and altitude to come down, kind of like a gliding plane. This method, coming down by just gliding without engine power, works fine at higher altitudes, but as the plane gets closer to the ground, it becomes dangerous. The plane speeds up way too much when descending and starts losing the necessary speed and lift, which are crucial for staying in the air. As soon as the engine power is reduced, controlling the speed becomes. The system also stopped maintaining the set speed of 132 knots. The plane was getting slower and slower, heading toward a point of no return. Now the speed, crucial for landing, wasn't being controlled by any automatic system. But the pilots didn't realize this. The training captain was supposed to keep an eye on every meter and screen, but no one noticed that the plane's speed was gradually dropping and it was descending rapidly. Then, no one gave any warning either. Then the system says 400 feet, and just 4 seconds later, 300 feet, meaning the plane was really close to the ground. Only then the captain says, "You've been in idle open descent mode the whole time." That means the plane was descending without any engine power, which is super dangerous at such a low altitude. But by then it was already too late. Both pilots didn't fully grasp how serious the situation was. The most important thing in the cockpit, situational awareness, was almost gone. Basically, when pilots land by looking at the runway with their own eyes, it's called a visual approach. They say you have to switch off the flight director at that point. But here, by mistake, it was left on, which went against Airbus safety rules. Now, the plane wasn't just dropping really fast, it was also losing the speed it needed, and in just a few seconds, they were about to realize how close they were to a huge disaster. Confusion was growing in the cockpit. The pilots were asking each other, "Is the autopilot still on?" From this conversation, it was clear the pilots themselves weren't really sure which systems were on and which were off. At that moment, they should have immediately aborted the landing and gone around, as they say in aviation. But that chance was already gone. The plane's speed kept dropping, but the pilot had no idea. The ground was getting closer. Yet, inside the cockpit, there were no alarms or warnings. Everything was completely silent. Then, when the plane was just 135 feet above the ground, a safety system kicked in called Alpha Floor Protection. This system automatically boosts the engines to prevent the plane from stalling. It was the last chance. Right then, the captain suddenly realizes how serious the situation is. He gasps and says, "We're going down." He immediately pushes the engine lever all the way forward. That's called the toga thrust. It was the right move. But by now, it was too late. The A320 engine takes about 8 seconds to reach full power. Unfortunately, before those 8 seconds were up, the plane crashed into the ground about 2,800 feet before the runway, hitting at a speed of 209 kilometers per hour. The impact was so strong that both engines and the landing gear broke off from the plane. But the disaster didn't end there. Another huge problem had just started. The plane caught fire. It was no longer just a crash. It turned into a race against time. Out of 146 people on board, 92 lost their lives, including both pilots and 2 cabin crew members. The investigation was carried out by the Indian government's court of inquiry. They found that everything seemed normal until the final moments of the flight. Both pilots were experienced, worked well together, and followed all the rules. But everything changed in just 35 seconds. The investigation revealed that the pilot didn't realize in time how bad the situation had gotten. Even when the radio altimeter kept showing heights like 400 feet, 300 feet, 200 feet, they didn't push the throttle forward to increase engine power, which is the most crucial step in such a scenario. The investigation couldn't clearly determine how the plane ended up in that turn, while the engine was running at low power. The report only suggested a few possibilities, like maybe there was a mistake setting the altitude by the training captain, or maybe there was some issue with the A320 system. There was a design flaw that caused the control to accidentally switch, and it wasn't even recorded. After that accident, Airbus made several important changes to their planes. They redesigned the buttons and knobs to make sure pilots couldn't make mistakes. The cockpit screens were also made clearer and simpler so pilots always know exactly how fast the plane is going and how high it is. We might never know the full truth about what happened with Flight 605 that day. But one thing's clear, the lessons learned from that crash have made air travel already the safest way to travel, even safer, given. This story reminds us that even a small mistake can lead to a big disaster.